Hey everyone, I'm Rebecca Pickens. I am a certified book coach and a developmental editor, and I am also host of Self-Editing Essentials, a group coaching program for writers who have finished or almost finished writing their novel or memoir and are ready to learn the art of self-editing. So every Tuesday, I like to answer a question that comes to me from either a book coaching client or a member of my newsletter community. So my question today comes from Lori, who is a member of my group coaching program. She is asking about using dual timelines as a foil. She asks, is there any instance where there is one main timeline and a secondary timeline as a plot foil? Or if it does have to be equalish in length, would it be more acceptable instead to have a prologue and epilogue of the secondary timeline? So I think what Lori is really getting at is we are seeing more and more in certain genres of fiction. We see these dual timelines, and oftentimes those timelines are quite equal in length. We've got maybe a historical timeline, and we have a more current timeline, and those are both stories that have complete arcs. They have a beginning, middle, and an end, and there's a lot of synchronicity between the way that these timelines come together. But that's not the only way to work with a timeline. And Lori's question really gets to the heart of an interesting one. So let's dig in. Timelines exist, they have very particular functions. First of all, every timeline has to have a narrative purpose. We need to always ask ourselves, why does this timeline need to be? Does it actually need to be? Common reasons for including a timeline are that we get character illumination. There's something about your timeline that tells us important things we want to know about, say, your story's protagonist. It can also provide a thematic echo or foil or contrast between characters, and it can help with foreshadowing. It can really, another timeline can add to suspense, tension. So these are the fundamental reasons that an author may decide to include a secondary timeline in their story. In actuality, even though lately we're seeing a lot of these timelines that match up in length, the reality is your second timeline's length is really secondary to its function, to what purpose it serves in your story. So the question you want to ask before you do anything further, if you're thinking about incorporating a second timeline, ask, what would I lose if I did not include this timeline? Because honestly, working with another timeline adds new challenges. It also adds great texture, more depth to your story, but it's going to be some extra work. So you really want to make sure that there is a good reason and that you understand the reason for adding the secondary timeline. So the timeline example that I've given so far takes into account these equal timelines. But what we're going to also talk about today are secondary timelines. A full or equal timeline means that that timeline has a major narrative arc. It is taking up a significant part of your story. It's got stakes, it has resolution, so it's just a story within another story. It can function in a lot of different ways, perhaps a subplot. Its job is to drive tension, character growth, resolution. But we also have this really interesting tool we can think about, which is called the secondary timeline. And that's really what Lori's question is digging into. This is a timeline that doesn't necessarily have the same length, the same scope, the breadth that your full timeline has. It doesn't have to have an arc, stakes, or resolution. It can simply function as a foil. It can frame some kind of a theme. It can echo something else in your main timeline. It's there to support the main story without actually providing a full arc. So let's look at what I mean by that. There are three functions of a secondary timeline. There are probably others. These are the ones that come to mind immediately. These are the ones that we will see most often in writing. The first I've mentioned already is the foil timeline. And what that does is it really highlights the choices or mistakes of certain characters in your main timeline. And I'm going to give examples of these three functions in just another minute. But right now, I want to just give you this overview. We've got the thematic mirror, and that simply means you have a secondary timeline that is echoing the larger themes that we see in your primary timeline. And finally, we've got a big reveal. You can use a secondary timeline to fill in critical backstory or add or take away from some of the mystery in your initial primary timeline. So first, let's look at that foil timeline. The purpose is to really highlight the choices, the mistakes, the evolution of the character that you're featuring in your main timeline. So what that might look like, you may have a detective who in the main timeline is struggling to catch a serial thief in the here and now. In your secondary timeline, your foil timeline, we can take a look at 10 years ago at this detective or perhaps another detective who is maybe new on the job and makes all the mistakes that are not being made in the main timeline. And the effect is that by looking at these past failures, you're highlighting what your current detective in the here and now is doing exactly right, how they are turning these circumstances around and having success. The second type of timeline you may want to play with is the thematic mirror or reflection timeline. And the purpose of this is to reflect the main timeline's themes through a different setting or a different character by getting to experience a storyline through the eyes of somebody different, we glean new understanding. It deepens our understanding. It may make us think about something in a different way than we're able to by simply having that primary timeline. So this is a really fun thing to play with, and it's a great way to really drive home key messages of your story. So here's an example to look at. On our main timeline, we have a young woman who is learning to forgive a sibling after a family betrayal. Now, to mirror all of that, to deepen the experience that we have in watching this main timeline unfold, we may have a secondary timeline, a mirror timeline, that features the character's grandmother a century ago facing a similar betrayal. But in that instance, she chooses revenge. So she does something very different than her granddaughter. The effect of this is the past timeline is mirroring the theme of forgiveness versus revenge, but it's showing us the other side of the equation. It's showing us the consequences of revenge versus this forgiveness that we're looking at in our primary timeline. Really cool. Finally, we have the reveal or the exposition timeline. And the purpose here is just to provide information, to shine light on backstory, secrets, gives additional context, to give your main story more information, more details. It just fills in information gaps that we may have if we only were to rely on the primary timeline. So an example of this, a scientist races to prevent an ecological disaster. The secondary timeline, the reveal, might be journal entries from the lab's founder that slowly begin to be unearthed, and they're revealing a hidden experiment that's gone wrong decades ago. And somehow that really has a lot of impact on what the scientist has to deal with in the here and now. And so, because we have that background, we have that information, the stakes immediately start to grow higher and higher. The tension increases. And so, we're really riveted trying to find out what the outcome is going to be with this new, based on this new information. So, now we understand why we might have an unequal timeline, why we may have this secondary timeline. But there's still the question of, okay, how do we deal with this unruly thing so that it fits in the rest of our story and doesn't just feel tacked on? The primary timeline is what's going to dominate your story. It's the thing where that's going to feature the narrative arc and the emotional journey that your primary characters undergo. Whereas your secondary timeline needs to be feathered in rather strategically. It can be you can play with it in terms of where it comes in chapters. You could use journal entries like the example I just gave. You could feature flashbacks. There are a lot of different ways to subtly insert your secondary timeline. The probably my biggest tips in terms of doing this would be to keep your secondary timeline shorter. It needs to be important, it needs to be impactful, it needs to resonate with readers, but it does not need to keep up with the primary timeline because that's not what it's doing in this story. You can also, it's really important that writers keep that reader in mind. We don't want them to get lost and confused in terms of what timeline they're reading about. So simply introducing some time markers or using a really different stylistic shift, like going into journal entries instead of straight prose, could be a handy way to indicate when you're shifting time. Whatever you choose, you want to make sure it's consistent and clear. And finally, ending each segment of your unequal timeline, of your secondary timeline, with a beat that echoes or heightens the plot, right? This is not filler. This is not unimportant stuff that you happen to stick in. This timeline is moving the dial forward, and it's got a very specific purpose that you have identified that makes it relevant to your story. So you want to give it the right placement in your book so that it has a chance to propel your story forward. So when we're doing all of this kind of maneuvering, we want to be thinking about how our reader is experiencing it. So again, clarity. You never want to confuse the reader in terms of the chronology or the emotional trajectory, meaning the placement of your secondary timeline is fundamental. It's very important to make sure it's being spread out mindfully, that it is easy for readers to follow where they are in history, so that it is really providing clarity, not doing the opposite. Balancing suspense and release between timelines is important. And finally, making sure that these timelines are in conversation with one another. They're not just there as two separate stories. They really are overlapping. They are touching points with each other from time to time in the story so that we understand how your secondary timeline is helping you really clarify your primary timeline and how it's supporting it so that the messages in that primary timeline are really resonating with your reader. So finally, as a takeaway, you might want to walk away with these questions in mind. When you are thinking about including a secondary timeline, ask yourself, what is the core function of your secondary timeline? Is it big? Is it full? Does this timeline need to align with your other timeline? If so, it needs a full arc. Or is it a supporting timeline, a secondary timeline? In which case, it can have an arc, but it doesn't need to have an arc. Does it interweave with the main story effectively? In other words, is it part of the world that you are creating with your primary timeline? It's not happening somewhere over here. It somehow is going to eventually, if not immediately, it's going to eventually kind of crash into your primary timeline, and we're going to see how the two overlap and how they've informed each other. And finally, does each segment of your timeline deliver tension, revelation, or does it resonate with your theme in some profound way? These are the questions that will help you answer whether or not you need that secondary timeline and whether or not it's going to be primary or secondary. That's the other question to ask yourself. I am all about timelines. I think having additional timelines is a wonderful way to add some texture and some depth to your story. It's a lot of fun to play with, and it can be a lot of fun to read. So I hope these ideas are helpful for you. If you have any questions at all, stick them in the comments section. I would love to answer them for you. And please, if this video was helpful, hit like and subscribe for more videos like this one every Tuesday. Thanks so much. Happy writing, everyone.